What's the most NSFW thing you saw go down at work? Story 1. Saw my boss and a coworker making out. They were both married at the time. Each came into my office later that day and had a little sit down with me on why these types of things happen. I was 26 years old at the time. Story 2. Had a fire drill at work one night. Attendance was taken and 2 people were missing. Couple bosses went back in looking for them. Found them in a storage room having sex. Boss told them to finish up, have a good time, go home, and don't bother coming back. Story 3. First day at a job and out of nowhere an employee yells across the office at the boss, "We all know you're cheating on your wife with the secretary." The boss freaked out and started yelling at all of us that his personal life is none of our business. The secretary was crying and they both left. I was supposed to be training with the boss that day, but because he was gone, we all just went down the street to some Mexican restaurant and drank all day. Pretty cool gig, even if it was very short-lived. Story 4. When I worked at a hotel, one of the housekeepers was known to hook up with guests from time to time. The head housekeeper caught her in the act once when she was trying to inspect rooms. Story 5. Working part-time at Toys R Us one Sunday, I got a call on the radio to please remove a couple of people from the diaper section. When I got there, I found 2 middle-aged people having sex and she was pressed against the rack. When I told them to stop, he just turned to me with an offended look while standing fully erect. It was an awkward escort out of the store. Story 6. I was working second shift security in a pharma company and a line worker came out of the boss's office all disheveled. The boss had gone home already, so I kept watching, and 2 dudes come out of the office a few minutes later. One was still putting his pants back on. They were extremely surprised that the door to her office was on camera. Turns out one of the dudes had stolen a master key from the janitor's cart and had been using the manager's office as a bang pad. Story 7. When I was a teenager, I put a folder on the family computer's hard drive labeled Dirty Pictures because we had just got our first internet connection and my brother and I were warned not to be looking up stuff we shouldn't. I went out and took pictures of any bare spots of dirt I could find and put them on the computer. Now that sounds like an easy prank to you kids today with your USB cables and your smartphones in this future space year of 2021, but back in the dim pre-industrial dystopia that was 1996, it was a little more difficult. I had to take the pictures with this miserable little 110 camera and then get the film developed and pay the extra money to send the film off to be scanned onto a CD-ROM by Dark Ages Smiths using hammers and very tiny punches to strike tiny pits into the CD. After a 3-week wait, I'd go back to the store and get my CD and developed pictures, but Dad's reaction was worth it. Story 8. Caught 2 employees banging in a laser tag arena supply closet with an arena full of children and the game running. I've even seen poop on the ceiling. The ceiling. Story 9. I worked as a janitor at a hospital. There was a private restroom on the 2nd floor. On multiple days, someone positioned themselves above the toilet and took a dump all over it. It turned out to be a janitor on second shift. Story 10. Watched someone get burned, blow up. Night shift in the winter about 4 years ago. He needed to preheat a piece of steel, so he turns on the gas but goes away for 15 to 30 seconds to find his flint striker and comes back and makes the spark. He had 3rd-degree burns on most of his body. Came back 3 months or so later with pics of all the blisters, scabs, all the nasty stuff. Story 11. Back in the 90s, I worked at a car wash. Across the alley from the car wash was a small condo with a balcony facing us. One day, a guy was totally banging his girlfriend from behind on the balcony facing us. They were clothed, but pants dropped, skirt hiked. We started to notice after a while, and as we pointed and showed more co-workers, their tempo increased and then they finished, and we cheered them on. Story 12. I had a co-worker that took a massive amount of drugs on busy construction sites, to the point he would sway around and barely keep his feet. The company knew, but was so desperate for workers, they turned a blind eye and never did anything about it. Shit company couldn't keep anybody longer than a year except for this guy. had many close calls on the sites, and somehow never died. One day he just drove off a site in the middle of the day. The company's trucks were GPS tracked, so they found him OD'd in it in a shady part of town. Story 13. Wasn't there, narrowly leaving before this. 30-year-old female assistant manager at Burger King had post-close birthday party at Burger King. Most of us were high schoolers besides her and one or two others. Last three people at this party are her and two 17, 18-year-old guys I knew well. She had a male-female threesome with both of them at the BK. She was also engaged. Cameras captured pretty much all of the event. I came in the next morning to the general manager explaining what had happened and that we had 3 new openings. Story 14. Cinema usher, end of the night and waiting for the final films to finish and clear up. One guy was sitting in the back row. We would be standing at the front to the side, watching the credits. It's not uncommon for this, but the end credits finish and he's still there. Well, I begin to walk up the stairs towards him, and he hasn't noticed me, and I can make out that he looks like he's asleep. As I get closer, he suddenly looks at me and mouths something. Another head pops up from his lap. Another guy had been going to downtown with him. I instantly froze, turned around, and walked back down to the exit. They rather sheepishly left a few minutes later. I thanked them for their visit and hoped they enjoyed the movie. Story 15. I worked for U-Haul about 11 years ago, and the location was behind a sketchy-ass club that changed ownership constantly from lawsuits and shit. I came in one Saturday to open, and my manager was late, so I was alone. I get inside, start pulling out the displays to the showroom and shit, and I hear a loud-ass bang on the front door. Scared the shit out of me. I look over, and there's a naked girl out there crying and begging me to let her in. I grabbed a moving blanket to cover her and called the cops. She was covered in her own shit and had dried blood all over her. Turns out she got drugged at the club that night and got gang raped. I apologize for using the word banged instead of raped. I certainly know the poor girl was raped and didn't consent and left out there passed out. When she came to, she came running to the first place she saw, which was U-Haul. Story 16. I did not see the event, only the aftermath. But when the Fellini's in the mall where I worked was bought out, changing its sign to Macy's, a worker was electrocuted and died. At first, mall management tried to stay open, but the police forced them to close for the day. Possibly a rumor only, but I later heard that the Fellini's Macy's manager had insisted that the electrician work the sign hot. Story 17. I work for a medical device company. We have an on-site cadaver lab for testing. Well, one day the lab freezer, where we kept human tissue samples, broke. The new one wasn't going to arrive for a few days. The lab tech wanted to move the samples to the freezer in the break room in the meantime. You know, where we keep food. His boss got wind of it before he actually moved them and put a stop to it. Story 18. I see some people posting work-related injuries on here, so I'll share mine. I used to work in the kitchen at a fine dining restaurant. We were supposed to say oven door whenever we would open it, especially if someone had their back to you. The guy that I worked with was super shy to the point of not saying things when he should, and so he didn't tell me that he opened the door behind me. I turned around with a handful of trays and my arm smacked right into the door. It was so hot that I didn't even realize that I got burned until I pulled my arm away and my skin was still on the door. Well, he never apologized for it, and I got real sick of seeing his guilty puppy dog look that he would give me every day for the rest of the time that I worked there. Story 19. I was a bartender working at a popular psychedelic drug-themed pizza chain in my college town. Guy sat at the bar for about 30 minutes and we talked about music and playing guitar and just seemed like a super nice, cool guy. Then he was like, "I'm going to grab a table and eat now. Good talking to you." Left a solid tip, but what he really meant was, "I'm going to go sit in a booth and stare at that table of girls while I jerk off under the table now." And that's what he did. Luckily, the girls immediately and loudly called him out and we ran him off. We heard rumblings around town about the same thing happening at several other spots. Story 20. I used to work at a library, and there was a homeless guy who would come in every other day, and he used to drunkenly piss his pants while sitting on the upholstered chairs. It got to the point where we were replacing the chairs since the smell sunk in, and we ended up banning him for a year. Story 21. When I used to work at In-N-Out Burger, the fry girl accidentally chopped off part of her finger using the potato slicer. The entire sink was filled with fries and blood in which the tip of her finger was floating around. It was quite the spectacle. Story 22. I used to work at a museum, and we had a strict zero food policy in the museum galleries. There was an interactive kids exhibit in one of our rooms about nocturnal creatures, and there was a little campfire corner with an actual camping tent set up. I was making the rounds one day, and all of a sudden I hear this munching sound coming from the tent. It literally sounded like someone was loudly chewing oatmeal in there. Well, me not even thinking about it twice, I popped my head right into the tent, ready to say something along the lines of, "Excuse me, food items aren't allowed in the..." With horror, I realized the origin of the sound wasn't some kid eating snacks. All I could do was freeze. I happened to look down, and the woman was jerking the guy off by palming him over his jeans without a care in the world. All of this inside a campfire tent in a kid's nocturnal creatures exhibit. Well, I was too shook to tell him to go, so I went to find the nearest maintenance worker we had working. He was an ex-military sergeant in his 60s. He gave them one hell of a speech. I was in shock the whole time, but highly entertained. Story 23. Woman pulled up behind our building. We had on-site security and lots of cameras. She stops, gets out, drops her pants, and shits behind the building. Security goes out to ask her what the fuck she's doing. She scoops the mess up with napkins and drives away. Our office was near a mall and an interstate highway. There were restaurants and fast food everywhere. There was no reason for her to do that behind our building. Story 24. Working as a raft guide on a beginner's trip with moms and kids and grandparents, a girl swimming in the creek along our route flashed her boobs to all the rafts as we floated by. And 0 tips were given to the guides because somehow this was our fault. Story 25. Guy came into work very late, back office for a bank, with 2 black eyes and completely beaten up. In front of everyone and quite loudly said it was his girlfriend, but "You think I'm bad, you should see her." He was being serious too. Someone also caught him doing a line in the office toilet before he started work that day too. Story 26. I'm a teacher. Our smart boards are linked to our computers, but you can freeze what's on the board so the students can do the work, and you can check emails, do registers, etc. One guy thought he'd frozen the board and proceeded to sext his missus over email during a lesson. He was at least smart enough to use his personal email, but he was dumb enough not to check the board was actually frozen. Result was students photographing the rather scandalous emails and Snapchatting them to each other. I work on a different site, and within 2 hours it was all over my site as well. The guy no longer works for us. Story 27. I studied medicine in El Salvador, and during my surgical rotation, we saw a lot of weird shit. This one time, an ambulance brought 2 drunk guys who had been fighting because one of them said that pork pupusas were better than cheese pupusas. Pupusas are a local dish. The other guy took offense and attacked. Both drew their machetes and carved each other up. One guy was eviscerated. He was holding his guts in his hands, and the other guy was severely injured in his face, arms, and back. I don't remember the outcome. This kind of incident is common, unfortunately, mostly during the holidays when alcohol consumption is higher. Thanks for listening, guys. Don't forget to hit that like button and, of course, subscribe to the channel, and we'll catch you in the next one.